everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers podcast. And with me today is my friend, Joel Rosen. He's the guy who talks about adrenal issues. This is one of the things that gets his juices boiling. So we're going to talk to him about a lot of things about adrenal issues. We're going to talk about adrenal fatigue. We're going to talk about, what does that really mean and how we can kind of assess it, what maybe creates some issues that may make your adrenals not work so well, and kind of get into a bunch of that stuff. So Joel, how are you doing today?
Hey buddy, I'm doing really great. Excited to be here with you.
Awesome. So can you give the listeners a little bit of information about you? I know your practice is in Boca, Florida, Boca Raton, Florida. And I know you have a fantastic website, thetruthaboutadrenalfatigue.com, but why don't you give the listeners a little bit more information about who you are, how you got into this whole adrenal fatigue area of work?
Sure. I mean, much like yourself and probably your other guests, I had my own health challenges with burnout and exhaustion and fatigue and stress and blood sugar imbalances and focus and anxiety. I had just graduated from chiropractic college with over $150,000 worth of student debt. My wife was pregnant with twins. She had to be on bed rest at 20 weeks. And we had moved from Canada to LA to Florida. And I was exhausted and burnt out, Eric, when I had just graduated. And I re-injured my back and I just didn't have energy, just didn't have focus. And one of my patients just started my practice, took out another loan. And one of my patients was an acupuncturist, and he brought in a book called Why Do I Have Thyroid Symptoms Even Though My Blood Tests Are Normal by Dr. Karazian. And I was like, I don't have a thyroid problem. I don't need this book. So it sat on my desk for about 6 months and something gravitationally pulled me towards it. And when I opened the chapter on adrenal fatigue, it was like a carbon copy of myself. And it's like, how have I never heard of this? I have an exercise physiology degree. I have a psychology degree. I had just graduated from chiropractic college, and I have no idea what this thing is. So that was the serendipitous discovery of what my life mission would be after this. If I don't know about this, why do other people not know about this? And I'm sure it's an epidemic because everyone is overstressed and too much stimulants and caffeine and sugary diets and life and everything else in between. This is an epidemic, only to realize that it's a term that's not accepted. So I wore that with a badge of honor, saying, hey, you know what? I don't mind putting the bullet marks on the bullseye on my back and shoot arrows at me, because I'll carry that all the way home until I help other people realize the truth about adrenal fatigue.
So let's kind of get into this because you brought it up. So I'm going to follow up. There is this kind of controversy about adrenal fatigue. So first, let's get into this. I guarantee you there's some people, everybody's probably heard of adrenal fatigue, but let's talk about what the adrenals are. Where are the adrenals located? What's their kind of role? And then we'll get into what adrenal fatigue is. So what are the adrenals? Where are they located? What do they do?
Sure. So they sit on top of the kidneys. They're little almond-sized, really small glands that help to regulate and control. And they have what I tell people is they have a role in the stress response. The brain signals to your body, not just the adrenals, by the way. So it's not just an HPA axis, a hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, but basically they help secrete mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. Also, they help to basically, I tell people the three main functions that they do is they help to reduce inflammation, they help to give you energy, and they help to balance your fluid levels. And those are really important during times of stress. And so that's typically what we think of when we think of adrenal function. We think about cortisol. That's the main hormone, but it regulates our sex hormones as well. It does a lot of different things, just like the thyroid does. But I think the problem in today's day and age is that, I mean, I love Hans Selye. I have 3 of his books, 1, 2, and 3. These are all Hans Selye's book, and he was the pioneer of the adrenal fatigue term, which really doomed the actual. Like at the end of the day, it's a crappy term. It sucks. It's not a good way to explain what's going on. But he was one of the first researchers that talked about the simplistic model of the alarm phase. So you have a stressor, and then your body sounds the alarms. Then you have a resistance phase where it can keep up with those alarms, and you have an exhaustion phase. But this is in the 60s, you know, and knowledge has changed since then. And unfortunately, allopathic doctors are not open to the shades of gray. And because the term sucks so poorly, they just dismiss it as a throwaway diagnosis as someone who's been on the internet and searches this term, and it's a tell for them to know, okay, this is going to be one of those tough patients that, you know, that thinks they're the doctor and they can research this. Meanwhile, we don't have any operational terms, or we don't teach it in the school system. We don't, you know, define it in terms of the adrenals completely exhausting. So therefore, we don't have any studies around it. So what you're suffering with is just an internet diagnosis. So I think I kind of expanded on your question, but that's kind of where we are with adrenals.
So I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit from a medical allopathic standpoint. And this happens in thyroid physiology as well. It happens in a bunch of things. One of the reasons why an allopathic physician would say, hey, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue, is because they're looking at it from more of a black and white perspective. Like you either have hypercortisol, right? Or you have hypocortisol. You either have Cushing's disease or you have Addison's disease. And those are diagnosable disorders of adrenal dysfunction, disease, right? And so the issue is there's not a criteria for the function or malfunctional perspective, or the adaptive changes that occur in adrenal physiology. And we talk about that on the podcast about thyroid physiology. You can have glandular disorder, disease, and you can have just poor regulation or adapted regulation of thyroid physiology where you don't feel good. You have hypothyroid symptoms, but the gland is still fine. You could have normally functioning cortisol gland, normally functioning HPA axis, but still have symptoms of too much or too little cortisol without having disease of the adrenal gland. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think there's research that shows that 90% of adrenal dysfunction occurs outside of the adrenals. So absolutely 100%. You don't have to have a all black or all white. It's too low, it's below the threshold, so it's an adrenal insufficiency, or it's nothing. Right. It just doesn't work like that. And you know, what's really interesting is that we are learning as research trudges forward, and I'm sure Hans Selye would be happy to know about this and would change up his what we call it. But ultimately, you have all these compensatory mechanisms that make testing for absolute cortisol levels, or for even that matter, free fractions through saliva values, very difficult to interpret, because we can, like as an example, heat shock proteins, or the increased in binding of the free fraction, upregulation of enzymes to deactivate cortisol levels, HPA feedback loop issues. There's so many detoxification issues of hormones, or having the vital nutrients in the microbiome to potentiate things. And you're looking at like a small version of it on a piece of paper, which is already limited on itself, to have to say, oh, it's not higher or it's not lower than this number, so you're fine. That's where a lot of the problems lie. But yes, to answer your question, 100%, that there's a difference between a glandular issue and a cellular issue, for sure.
Yeah. So if you understand the concept that we talk about often on the podcast, is that, hey, you can absolutely have signs and symptoms of an organ, what seems like an organ not functioning well, despite having a perfectly healthy organ. Because many times, as Joel is saying, when he's saying it's happening outside the organ, the adrenal gland may be getting excessive stimulation because of something that's stimulating the adrenal gland to make more cortisol, or the adrenal gland may not make as much cortisol because of something that's inhibiting the stimulation of the adrenal gland. Adrenal gland's fine. It's the messaging, it's the signaling. And sometimes, especially when there's adrenal issue, like a hypoadrenal state, it could be that the precursors to make cortisol, especially one of those things in today's world where we have people with on medications that suppress cholesterol production, and cholesterol is like a foundational piece that's needed to make adrenal hormones and other hormones. And if you're suppressing cortisol production, you might have your body saying, hey, we need to make more, but you don't have the resources to generate that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, you take a look at the diagnostic criteria of gold standard for adrenal insufficiency is an ACTH test. And I'm not 100% sure, I should know this answer, but I would say full disclosure, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it's between 10 to 100 times the level that they give you for the ACTH pituitary hormone that will cause the adrenals to make a hormone to determine if it's functioning okay. So think about that. Like, that's assuming, okay, I just want to see if the adrenals, I'm going to knock on the door. I want to see if anyone's going to answer the bell by giving you the knock, by giving you the ACTH. So I just want to see if, but you're assuming that everyone's knocking on the door. And they may not be, because the amount that they give you to test the baseline levels is 10 to 100 times more than what your body's normally able to produce. It's a big assumption, you know?
Yeah, so you're giving what they call in the business supraphysiologic doses to try and get a stimulation. So it's essentially like saying, hey, the people are in the basement, they got the radio on, and I'm going to knock on the door and see if it's listening. Well, if it's a soft little rap on the door, no, they may not hear it, but they still might be home, right? And they would respond if they could hear it, but there's so much other distraction. But if we come in with a big battering ram or a truck and ram the door in, are they probably going to come up? Yeah. If I blow the door up, right, are they probably going to come up and answer the door? Probably, right? Because it's this massive response. So I think that's a good point. So let's talk about cortisol, because cortisol kind of gets demonized to some degree, like it's bad, but cortisol really isn't bad. It's part of a normal response. So talk to me like let the listener know, like, they shouldn't fear cortisol per se, right? Now, cortisol out of balance with other things can be a problem, but why would your body normally cause a rise in cortisol?
I mean, it's programmed over the millennia, you know, how our body responds to stress. It's a fight or flight thing. So it keeps us alive. It's a signaler. And it helps the body with genomic expression in terms of turning things on and turning things off. Ultimately, like I said, helps to settle inflammation and helps to produce energy. So it will help glycogen be broken down for immediate release. And not even that, even before that, the neurochemicals of your catecholamines to get that adrenaline response to be able to live, you know, basically. The problem is that with our environment and our society and our 24/7 and our EMFs, it's constantly going. So, there's always a Goldilocks zone for everything. And too much or too little is usually the problem. And I think when people think about cortisol, they think about too much. And they think, oh, I'm releasing way too much cortisol, I got to suppress it. So yeah, I mean, cortisol is a necessary thing. If we didn't have cortisol, we wouldn't live very long. I tell everyone that I work with now, to one way, shape, or form, they have overactivation of their mast cells. This is a whole other category, but they have overactivation of their mast cells because of EMFs, stress, environment, chemicals, all of the above. And the mast cells have been found to stimulate the HPA axis. I mean, they sit on the hypothalamus and stimulate that. Ultimately, when mast cells are released, they produce histamine. Histamine is a excitatory neurotransmitter, which again is necessary, but cortisol will be released to tame histamine. So there's a lot of nuances and, feedbacks, and this causes that, but causes this, which causes that. But long story short, it's a necessary hormone for us to survive.
Yeah. And so when we think about cortisol's gets the bad rap because it's causing my stress, or it's causing my inflammatory issues, or it's causing my extra adipose tissue. But I think we have to be cautious in trying to suppress it, because you need a certain amount of cortisol. As Joel was saying, when there's a stress response, especially an acute stress response, you want your cortisol to rise. That's saying, hey, let's get some more blood sugar out here. Let's get this body ramped up to kind of deal with what that elevated stress response is triggering, right? So it's part of that stress response. Matter of fact, it's even part of when you wake up in the morning, you need a surge in cortisol. They call that the cortisol awakening response, that you get this surge of cortisol to kind of dump some glucose out into the tissue, out into the bloodstream, to say, okay, let's get this brain and body moving. It's time to get going. And it does. It has this anti-inflammatory effect. And so there's this benefit in the short run. The problem becomes if it's extended, like long-term high levels of cortisol, that can become problematic, right? And so it can create a host of issues. I think we would probably agree that the elevated cortisol isn't technically the problem. It's what's constantly driving that high levels of cortisol that may be the problem. If for you, as you're talking to people with adrenal issues, and they come to you, we know that high levels of cortisol, especially when high cortisol is out of balance with DHEA or DHEAS, we know that's really problematic. I think almost every all-cause mortality is increased when you have an abnormal ratio, or cortisol is dramatically higher than your DHEA or DHEAS. And we look sometimes as with this low cortisol production, or adrenal fatigue, we might say, as the downside. How do you express to your patients, or do you express to your patients that, hey, maybe this lack of cortisol after chronic stress is maybe not a bad thing, but actually a protective mechanism? Do you ever look at it or talk to your patients from that perspective, that the lack of excessive cortisol production may at some point become a protective response?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to finish off, you're saying in terms of the other analogy I would have for just looking at that cortisol and thinking it's bad is like looking at the weather thermometer and thinking it's bad. Like, oh, it's in the red, or it's below zero, like the thermometer is broken. It's like, well, the environment that's putting it there needs to be addressed. But to answer your question, as far as the compensatory decrease in cortisol being potentially a good thing, it's like we talked about earlier in terms of the body's thermostats and the communicating messages to each other to preserve energy at the end of the day from a cell danger point of view. And it's like you talk about all the time, it's a appropriate response for inappropriate length of stress or time for your body to deal with things. I'll give you an example. On the Dutch test, I love to run the Dutch test. It's a 5-point urine test. I sometimes do the plus. The plus is the one with the cortisol awakening response. Lots of research that shows when there's a flattened cortisol awakening response, that's more chronic, more problems with chronic illness and morbidity and mortality. So you really do want to have that circadian boost within the morning where it rises, whether or not you have high cortisol or not. You want that rise. But one of the compensatory mechanisms we see very commonly on the Dutch test is the upregulation of 11-beta-HSD2, which converts cortisol into cortisone. And one of the ways I explain that, it's almost like the analogy for you at the cellular level with reverse T3. The gland is the general, and the gland will make, or the brain is the general, and the gland is sort of the first order where the general tells the marching troops to work. But then you have the, at the battle site, and that's where, hey, do we need to tell the people that are at the battle site that we have too many troops? If we do, then we put them into deactive lists. And that's where cortisol turns into cortisone. Whereas if there's not enough troops, you can, at the cellular level, no matter what's going on at the glandular level, you'll squeeze that sponge out as much as you possibly can to get all that little juice at as much as you possibly can. That's where you have 11 beta HSD1 upregulating cortisol production. So you can see that on a test objectively that your body's working hard to deactivate it because it's been pounding and grounding too long. And yes, you can see a lot of instances where the body's compensating by either making it more active or less active at the cellular level.
So I think for my listeners, we talk about T4 being the circulating reserve and T3 is the primary hormone that's creating a lot of the actions inside the cell. So is it fair to say, based on what you just said, that cortisone is the circulating reserve and cortisol is the activated hormone, kind of like T3? So we could liken T4 to cortisone and T3 to cortisol. Is that appropriate?
Correct. Yeah, okay. I think that's a fair analogy. Yeah.
So for the listeners, when you have a stress response, or you wake up in the morning and you need more blood sugar, you need more stimulation, your body, if there's acute stress, your body's going to activate your adrenal gland to make a couple things. One, it's going to make some adrenal hormones, cortisol. It's also going to make some things called your catecholamines, which are like your fight or flight hormones. Okay. But you get your rise in cortisol, and there should be a rise in cortisol every day and a drop, right? We call that the cortisol rhythm. And then you're saying that, hey, now we've got this cortisol production, and it's really going to be in two forms in the body: cortisone, cortisol, right?
Right.
Okay. So you brought it up, so I'm going to kind of jump into this, and that is, if somebody, I wanted to finish the point. So from my perspective, and you could tell me, give me your perspective on it. Maybe if I'm wrong, you tell me. But what I look at, because we know that sustained levels of high cortisol are really damaging to the physiology, right? So if I've got sustained high cortisol because I got long-term stress and my cortisol is always high, there's naturally a feedback loop. And I think this is what you were talking to, where the body says, hey, we've got so much circulating cortisol in here, it's kind of circulating. Your body actually starts shutting down further production. And that can cause you to start to have lower levels of circulating cortisol, cortisone, especially in that free form, because your body's like, hey, we're overloaded here. We're going to shut this whole thing down because this excessive cortisol can be a problem. So sometimes that's not necessarily like you're in fatigue or you're shut down, but your body is actually doing the right thing. That sustained high cortisol, extremely damaging to the body. And so maybe if I just shut that down, yeah, I'm going to be tired, I'm going to be fatigued, but it's part of that protective response by decreasing some of the cortisol production. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair.
Awesome. All right. So we started talking about, you started getting into testing. I'm a big fan of the Dutch test too. And so when we talk about the Dutch test, if you're looking to test your cortisol levels, high, low, there's a bunch of different ways that they might get tested. Okay. So I want you to explain blood test, saliva test, urine test. Because if they go to their allopathic physician, they're primarily going to get a spot blood test or a 24-hour urine test for cortisol. They come to a functional practitioner and somebody may say, nope, you need saliva. They may go to a different functional medicine practitioner and says, urine. What do you think is the best way for somebody to assess their adrenal or let's just talk about cortisol physiology?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I would give you is looking at an X-ray. I mean, what's the best way? What's the best view to look at an X-ray? Is it face on? Is it from the side? I mean, you want a couple of views, right? To see, if you can notice where the crack or fracture or pathology is. So ideally, in a perfect world, I would like to have all three. I really would, because each of them tell us a different story. I'm partial to the Dutch test. I know that there's been, because it's a 4 or 5 point urinary test. Actually, I just got an email from the Precision owner saying that they have their first published study. I haven't read it yet, so I'm interested to see, because that was one of the knocks against it is that they don't correlate well to circadian rhythm. So that brings us to the saliva tests. Saliva tests are free fractions, so meaning what's not bound to a protein, whereas the blood is not a free fraction. It's what's bound to a protein, which transports it like a taxi cab in the body. So I like the saliva test. I don't run very much of them, but I get a lot of them when I'm first consulting with people, because that's what they've done. They know to do a saliva test. I take it with a grain of salt. I like that it gives me the circadian rhythm. For the most part, I like the circadian rhythm aspect of it, meaning when we first wake up, we should have high cortisol. When we go to bed, we should have low cortisol. And there is a cortisol awakening response within the first hour that we wake up. It typically doubles. And you want to see that with the saliva test now, where the old tests were just doing it at 8, at 12, at 6. Now they do it more according to when you first get up, and, half out, 15 minutes, half hour. So that's a really great test. If you can get a saliva test that has some form of cortisol awakening response, that's going to give you the most information for sure. And that's why the Dutch Plus has a double component where you're looking at the saliva in the awakening response within the first 15 half hour. And you also have urine tests. So I like a combination of them. The saliva is good because it tells you the circadian rhythm. And that was the knock on the urine test, is it doesn't correlate well to circadian rhythm, which I'll be interested to see what that new research shows. Because I do find, Eric, that anecdotally with people I work with, it does relate well to their circadian rhythm. The blood test is good too. I mean, listen, I want to know, like, especially if I know at a specific time that they're going, if they can go within, I mean, it's hard for them to go within a half hour to hour when they first wake up, but if they could, and we see it being in a nice, close to, I think depending on the lab ranges, like 6 to 23 for blood values, depending on what the units are and how they, test for it. Absolutely, you're not going to get great information if it's in the mid-range, because it's not lower than to be insufficient, and you don't know if it's higher. I mean, it's just an absolute marker. Like it's like one of those insurance policies. It's great that you never have to use it, like the information that it tells you. So a lot of clients will bring that to me. In fact, on my blood panel, I do include it because I want to see where it is. And then the 24-hour urine sample doesn't give us any circadian information whatsoever, right? Because we're combining it and shaking it up and we can't just say, okay, let's take that portion that was at that time, kind of like an air conditioner in a car where you have his and hers. Like, how does it know not to cross over the line, in terms of you're cold and his is hot? Anyways, the 24-hour urine is helpful because, again, absolute amounts of metabolized. Now, metabolized meaning what's coming through the body, what's coming out of the body, what's been used from the body. That could be skewed based on kidney and creatinine levels if there's some challenges with filtration. I don't do very many of them, and I don't see very many of them these days anymore anyways, because I think the Dutch test, which is the dried urine test, has taken its place, which brings us to the dried urine. I like the dried urine because it's more done around your timing, like when you wake up 2 hours later, or the cortisol awakening response, when you have your dinner, when you go to bed. What's really great about it is it shows us the metabolites, meaning kind of the Plinko chips. How do they fall and how do they break down? It gives us enzyme activity like 5-alpha or 11-beta. It gives us the other hormones, sex hormones, DHEA, DHEAS, some of the androgens to know if the way they're being metabolized. Estrogen, phase 1 estrogen, phase 2 estrogen. So it gets more in depth. And I think if you can have a combination of all three of them, I mean, obviously that's going to be more pricey, then you're going to get a better view of the image per se. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So for the listener, if you go to your primary medical physician, you say, I think I have this adrenal fatigue issue going on. You may be told, hey, it doesn't exist, but we will, if they decide they're going to test, typically they're going to do a blood test. And the issue with getting the blood test done, as Joel was talking about, what that level is really depends on what time of the day you took the test, right? So what's normal really depends on time. So you really want to kind of know, especially as the physician, like what was the timing, how much cortisol is in circulation here, what time of the day was it? Was it morning? Was it mid-afternoon? What else was happening in this situation? So I think the cortisol test is good as long as it's kind of giving you an idea, you know, the time, and you understand what was going on during that time frame, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how it's functioning, right? Which is kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about, hey, what is that free fraction? The free fraction is what's available to support the tissue. So if you have cortisol that's in circulation, but it's bound to a protein, it's not really functional until it becomes free. And that's where the saliva piece can really help us out a bit. And then you're right, the urine helps us to see what the metabolites are. But sometimes I like to do them both. I really like the Dutch, when I'm talking about doing both, I really like the Dutch Plus test so I can see what's available in circulation and what's the body metabolizing. And do they match, right? Because I do want to see a certain amount of insert that's available, and I also want to see a certain amount metabolized, because you can have patterns. Well, hey, there's plenty available, but I'm not metabolizing much. That's a problem, right? And then you could say, well, I don't have much in circulation, but geez, I am metabolizing a ton, and that's a problem. So I think providing both of those answers on a Dutch test can help us identify this kind of problems we might see with appropriate adrenal physiology, and helps us identify what's the best way that we can help somebody. So I like both. I don't do, and I don't see, 24-hour urine collections anymore either. I just don't see many. I think most of the times when you're going to see that, that's somebody who's their physician is thinking, do I have Cushing's? Do I have Addison's? Do I really have those conditions going on? Because they want to see what the total output is. So if somebody thinks they have an adrenal issue, you're going to take a look at you're going to take a look at their hormones. You're going to look at cortisol. You're probably going to looking at a Dutch, but what's your strategy around it? Because there's going to be a lot of people, because there's a lot of blogs, a lot of posts that say, I'm trying to fix my adrenals. My adrenals are low. I want to increase my cortisol. I want to make it last longer. I want to drive it up, or that my adrenals are too high and I need to take some type of suppressant to bring my cortisol down. What's your explanation or discussion with the person when you say, hey, look, you have indications of this kind of, depending on what somebody wants to call it, this low adrenal output? What's your discussion? And then we'll flip it. What's your discussion with the person who's got high adrenal output?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same, to be honest. I don't like the term HPA axis dysfunction either, because I think it's getting too pretty and too cute to say it's only an HPA axis issue. It's a cellular issue. It's a system issue. It's a multi-system issue. And to say that it's only an HPA axis issue is really short-sighted. Adrenal fatigue sucks. At the end of the day, the term really stinks. Maybe I like the term in terms of like a homeopathos, pathos, or something where your body's not able to regulate its homeostasis any longer.
Well, it's adrenal. Couldn't you just call it adrenal allostasis?
That's a good
or cortisol.
Word too, yeah.
Just call it cortisol allostasis, right? Because you're having adaptive physiology of cortisol due to some type of stress response.
I know, but the sort of the nerd in me thinks it goes deeper than cortisol too, in terms of like mitochondrial some kind of cell data. I mean, there's so many.
Yeah, well, you and I, here's what I would say, because you and I would say, like, cellular hypothyroidism, right? It's not the perfect term because there's other things going on, the cell danger response. But cellular hypothyroidism is a way that people can identify that I have hypothyroidism in my cells, or tissue hypothyroidism. I have a hypothyroidism in my tissues. It still doesn't tell them how to fix it, but they can now understand, okay, that's glandular hypothyroidism. This is tissue hypothyroidism. And so from your perspective, you were looking at it from an adrenals perspective. If somebody's telling them, hey, your adrenals are fine, but I'm tired or fatigued or I'm wired and anxious, we definitely probably need kind of a better term than HP axis dysfunction, because you and I might agree that it's not even, it may not even be a dysfunction, but an adaptive change. So what's the term that we can call? Is it adrenal? Is it cortisol dysregulation? But I think we need some way to, like, tissue hypocortisol. I don't know how we have to define it, but I think we need some type of a term that helps somebody understand that you have a cortisol allostasis, right? You have adaptive changes in cortisol physiology. You do. That's what you do, right? Okay, so how do I fix it? Well, that's where we got to get to work, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, for that matter, when you describe it like that, HPA axis is doable, but to answer your question, it's very similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of you have two states. You have sort of a stress state and a controlled state. And ultimately, like, you don't get mad at the thermometer for showing too high or too low. You fix the environment. So same thing. I mean, one of the lessons that I learned just recently, probably within the last year, is how those mast cells with Dr. Theo Hardy's really sits on the HPA axis. That was a game changer for me, because so many things stimulate mast cells. Just stress alone stimulates mast cells. Iron dysregulation, glutamate, sulfite, dopamine, EMFs, mold, all of the cytokines, all of those things stimulate the mast cells, which is going to stimulate HPA axis. And when I see, like, this was a clinical pearl for me, when I see metabolized cortisol, like, all the way turned down to the right and even further than it can go, I really think about those mast cells going haywire. I do. So that's been a game changer for me. So what would I say for those people versus the ones where the dial is turned all the way to the left in terms of very low on a Dutch test with metabolized? Is same thing. Like, it's gotten to the point now where not so much the mast cells aren't sitting on the HPA axis. There's been a feedback loop to inhibit that pituitary from resignaling. So it's kind of shades of gray, Eric, in terms of, where is your body at? And I don't think it's linear either. I don't think it just goes from, throw a ball up in the air, it hits a peak and it comes down. I think it kind of jumps all over the place, meaning it doesn't just go from they used to have the staging of the adrenal fatigue, and I hate that as well. But, in terms of, say, Cellier's example of, you have the alarm, the resistance, the fatigue, that would imply a linear, it releases, it hits a peak, and then it falls down. I don't think that happens either. So basically, to answer your question, what do we do about it if it's high or if it's low? You still want to get to all of the reasons why your body's in an abnormal stress response. And you have to identify those things. You have to identify lifestyle, relationships, as you like to say, oxygen and breathing, activity and movement, nutrition, so many factors, EMFs. One of the biggest clinical pearls I'll tell people is start regulating your circadian rhythm. There's no small coincidence that your circadian rhythm controls so many functions in the body, of which cortisol production is one of them. And if your circadian rhythm is off, then all bets are off. So what we can have you do is we can have you get really great light exposure in the morning. I mean, I have 18-year-old twins, and you would think it's midnight in the middle of the day in their rooms, right? And then at night, it's like bright, all the lights are, that will mess your circadian rhythm up big time. Movement, when you eat your meals, signals to our body and our brain what time of the day and circadian rhythm cues that we have as well. So the big three would be controlling your light exposure at night. So when it gets dark out, you shouldn't be on your devices anyways, or you're wearing blue blocker glasses, you're not getting exposed to blue light. But equally important, when you're in the morning, you open up those curtains, you get a lot of sunlight on your body. Movement, your body just acclimates almost like a compass with movement. It tells your body where we are in the time and space of things. And then feeding, what time you're having your windows, so that you're not eating after dark or before, sun rises, because that will mess up circadian rhythms as well.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about, for the listener, when we're talking about, what is going to impact, what's going to cause your cortisol levels to be high and what's going to cause your cortisol levels to be low, I think what Joel was saying is it's the same stuff. right? It's the same stuff that's potentially going to cause it to be too high or too low. It's stress. And the reality is, many times, what's causing the cortisol levels to be too high is you've got this prolonged stress response that you're not having that kind of adaptive, like, hey, shut it down, right? Because if you keep that cortisol level high, that's why sometimes I tell people, listen, if you're dramatically stressed, if it's acute, you want those values to be high. If we look at somebody and they're in an active state of stress, you would expect those cortisol levels to be a bit higher. When you start to see them now that it's low and it's almost in that crash state, that's their body saying, okay, I can't do it anymore. Shut it down. It's too toxic. It's too much of an issue. We look at it because we're tired, we're fatigued, and maybe it's a protective response to prevent excessive amounts of damage. Kind of like when we have a sick cell, it's protective to downregulate thyroid physiology in the cell, because if I have a sick cell and I throw lots of thyroid hormone in there, I'm going to produce more oxidative stress that I don't have the physiology to deal with. And that's going to be more harmful. So if I'm hypoxic, I don't have oxygen in my cell, I don't want to drive a ton of energy. I want to slow the metabolism down so I don't create more damage and more stress. So I think that's important for somebody to take a look at, because we're looking at sometimes, oh, it's high, you need to take this to lower it. And if it's low, you need to take this to raise it, versus, okay, wait a second. High or low cortisol are potentially caused by excessive stress responses. And so what do I do? What's the best thing I can do? Probably not the secret supplement, but to take a step back and say, what can I do to modify the amount of stress in my life? And if I'm in an active high state, what can I do to help myself calm myself down? And if I'm in a really depressed state, I still got to have the same thought processes. How do I address the stressors in my life? And it doesn't sound sexy, but it is an excessive load of stress. So Joel, when somebody says to you, Dr. Rosen, you're telling me to reduce my stress. Do you know I'm a wife? I got 4 kids. I'm working. I got a husband who just got laid off. I got COVID. I'm trying to work at home, teach with my kids. And you're telling me to reduce my stress. How the heck do you expect me to do that? How do you help them?
Yeah, I mean, mindset number one. I mean, that person needs, like you said, to come to Jesus and say, hey, listen, you're not wrong in feeling that way, but is it serving you? And how is it actually, drinking poison and expecting other people to get sick? It's making your own body sick. So, a paradigm shift, number one. You mentioned it, breathing. Perceived stress. One of the main ways to operationalize stress is a perceived stress index that a lot of researchers use, and they can correlate your adrenal function with your perceived stress levels. So working on that is huge. I mean, you're not wrong you're justified, you're not wrong, but you need an attitude change. And it's easier said than done. And it's sort of like that tough but loving nephew that gives the client the suggestion, but coming up with strategies, like asking for help. Sometimes the people I talk to, and I'm sure you too, is they fight this battle every day, that they're not letting other people know how they feel, even though they may look perfectly fine on the outside, how they feel on the inside, and they put their Wonder Woman cape on, and less is more for them. So figuring out, like, how can I enroll or enlist help with other people? That was a big problem for me. Why I had my own fatigue issues is I just didn't want to ask for help. I didn't want to burden anyone for help. So asking for help, making sure that they regulate their circadian rhythm, control their light exposure, their eating habits, when they're eating, enrolling help, breathing, movement. Like you said, in another time we talked, is like a lot of the most effective therapies are free,
Yeah. And so it's tough, because what you perceive, like the person I gave you, right, is her situation real? Absolutely. Right. Yes. She's working. She's got kids at home. She's got all those things. They're all real. The issue is how how are you adapting to them, right? How are you perceiving it, right? And if you're saying this is all stressful, you got a much better chance that you're going to act in that manner where you're versus that inner self-talk where you say, I can handle this, I can adapt to this, is a better situation. That doesn't mean that it can't have a negative impact, even though you're going, hey, I'm chill, I got it all handled. You still may not have it handled, but definitely mindset becomes one of those key things. But there's also, there's tools that aren't free, but relatively inexpensive that they could use to assess stress levels and potentially to help kind of calm down the sympathetic stress response when we're in a chronic like overdrive situation. Is there any tools that you really like to work with or use with your clients to help them kind of calm that a kind of emotional stress or the perceived idea of stress, calm that sympathetic nervous system down a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've been through the evolution of wanting to help my clients so much that it gave them too much overwhelm, in terms of like, okay, I have them use like a chronometer to figure out their calories, have them use a glucose ketone monitor to figure out what's going on there, have them use the Aura ring with all of the stats that goes on there. And it's just like, oh my God, this is too much information. What, like, it's now I'm even more overwhelmed. So one of the most effective tools that I do still use though is the glucose ketone monitor. I love that, because I want them to learn the difference between, physiological hunger and psychological craving. There's a big difference. And a lot of the people that have what they feel is an adrenal fatigue based problem feel that they have a hypoglycemia challenge, or they've been told, hey, I got to have small meals more frequently to be able to keep my blood glucose from falling, thereby causing cortisol to be released to release blood into the bloodstream. And I know when I'm low blood sugar because I can feel it. I'm like, that's where we're not, like, you see these people all the time. It's got to be my hypothyroid. It's my thyroid that's going too much, or I can feel my insulin rising, or I can feel like I'm amazed. Like I can feel like I don't have the GI issues anymore. Like objectively and subjectively are two different things. So to be able to see objectively when, like, if you're in the middle of a crash, you're getting shaky, lightheaded, and jittery, and you take your blood glucose levels and it's 115, 120, all of a sudden you realize I don't need to have a meal right now. I'm not going to physiologically die if I don't eat anything or crash or slip into a coma, right? So I want them to calibrate. I want them to calibrate how they're feeling with what's going on physiologically. Number one. Number two, also the glucose monitor, I don't want them to be in ketosis per se, but I do want them to become what's called metabolically flexible, where they have the ability to burn protein, carbs, and fats if they need and use it as a fuel. If you're in a high stress, high cortisol, high insulin, high cytokines, high adrenaline, all of these things, you're not going to be able to produce ketones. And you are going to feel like you need that meal every so often, because you do have an insulin resistant issue and you're not necessarily getting good activity of glucose inside the cell. And ironically, even though your blood tests, your blood would show higher glucose levels, you're devoid of energy, and you feel we need to break that. We need to put a wrench in those mechanics. And I think that's a huge thing that people have, especially with my demographic, maybe not so much of yours, still probably, where small meals more frequently, and it's just like your glucose is way too high. We need to control that. If we can help them understand that, Eric, that's a huge leg up on top of mindset and movement and breath work and circadian rhythm. And again, that's not so much free, but it's not a very big investment to buy that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I have that same discussion with patients as well. I mean, if you think about what's happening and what goes on with cortisol, if your blood sugar is dropping low, you actually have 4 hormones that are designed to bring it up. 4. That's how important it is. Okay. You have epinephrine, you have cortisol, you have growth hormone, you have glucagon, all there to raise your blood sugar. You only have one to lower it, and that's insulin. Okay. And so there's systems in place. So when you get that shaky, that lightheaded, you think you've got to eat, right? But the reality is, as Joel just said, is that if you actually tested your blood sugar, your body's already compensated for that, right? It's already fixed that process, right? Part of what your body does is say, okay, let's get some cortisol out there. Oh, that's not good enough. Let's throw some catecholamines out there to kind of get that going. And sometimes that dizziness, that lightheaded, that not so good feeling, the nauseousness, that may be just massive dump of epinephrine versus that you just are in that low blood sugar state. Now you could be, so I think that's a great tool. Matter of fact, I just talked to somebody the other day. I'm going to do a little test for myself and get a monitor and wear it for the next 6 months and just kind of see where that is. It's not necessarily what every patient can afford to do, but I want to be able to kind of note that for them, to kind of show them. And then for somebody who does want to see where their blood sugar is, they can see what the impact of stress does, the impact of disrupted sleep, the impact of timing of where
EMF,
blood sugar is. Yeah, EMFs, all those things that it might have on your physiology. And so I think that's a really important conversation. I do totally understand your thought about more stuff for the wrong person to assess and analyze becomes problematic, right? I ask patients when we start, do you have any type of measurable device? Because if they have it, I want to put it to use. Most people, and one of the tools I like the most, and you've probably used it or tinkered with it, and that's HRV, your heart rate variability. And so most people, almost everybody today's got an Apple Watch on their wrist. They don't even know HRV is on that Apple Watch. And so we can look at HRV to kind of see where you are from a stress and a recovery response. So if they have it, I'll tell them. If they want to go get a Oura ring, I think it's great. If they want to get a BioStrap, I think that's great. The issue is you need one tool, not three tools. If you have three tools telling you the same thing, you don't have a tool, okay? Because you don't know which one to follow. But it is a great tool that can help somebody. Now, if they're already a person who's an overanalyzer, an overthinker, gets stressed out very easily, I want as few of those types of tools that they're going to stress over as possible. And if you've got that person who's already in wind-up mode, giving them as little things to stress about and worry about, probably not a good idea. Those are people you want to kind of take the tools, take the internet away, take the things that may make them start to go, oh my gosh, my HRV dropped 2 points. What happened? That's not probably the person we want to have those devices for, because they can actually get a little too wonky. As far as other devices that may help them calm, is there some favorites that you have to kind of help them kind of bring themselves out of a sympathetic state? Do you talk to them about meditation, breath training, things like heart math, or is there anything you really like to recommend?
Yeah, I mean, biofeedback, heart math. I love the brain tap. That's an awesome tool I use still to this day. I just got the heart math for myself. So I always like to implement strategies on myself first before I recommend it for other people. The Oura Ring does have the HRV on it. So I can use that and get an idea on how the stress that I've been going through in my life is impacting me. Activity levels and movements and steps, those are great too. Breath work, box breathing. There's a lot of great tools, and ultimately, I want someone to find their doing what they love. I remember one of the most profound books that I read was by Dr. Bernie Siegel. He's that oncologist that shaved his head for his cancer patients, and How to Live Your Life Between Office Visits was the name of the book. And that's what made me want to be a doctor. And ultimately, it's teaching people, it's not so much the supplements or what your blood tests show or what your actual diagnosis is. It's doing your passion. right? I mean, they said that a lot of these people that were given these terminal life sentence and they were going to die within a few years, they were interviewed and they've always wanted to be a comedian or a poet or an artist, but they had to take over the family business and they were never able to express their true happiness. And that's the thing, like people are always looking in the rear view mirror of, this isn't working, that's not working, it's not fair, I have this, I have that. And I remember having an epiphany with a client saying, Margaret, what would you do if you didn't have all of this? And she was looking through all her paperwork and looked up and was like, what do you mean? Like, well, if you were feeling great and you didn't have all these things going on, what would you do? And it was like, it was like an arrow hit her. And she was like, oh my gosh, I never really even thought of that. And it's like, well, you need to think about that because that's really your North Star. That's your lighthouse that you should benchmark your improvements for, not back here. How can you relatively tell you if you're getting better by looking at things in the past? So I think that's probably one of the key strategies is, okay, Mrs. Jones, what would you be doing if you didn't have this? And why do you have to wait until you're perfect to be able to do that? And start to gravitate towards that and start to feel that energy and start to make steps. Like you're not just going to go on vacation and then end up in Europe and they say, okay, I'm here, what do I do? You got a plan. And that's part of that brain, that frontal lobe that gets discombobulated with too much cortisol production. It gets it scrambled that you've lost that. So it's actually not only a therapeutic strategy, it's also, a way to help kind of get you to where you want to go to as well.
Hey, I think that's great. I think we'll kind of finish on that topic, that what creates a lot of stress in many people's lives is not living the life they want to live, right? And maybe living vicariously through somebody else's life, fake life on Facebook or Instagram, and being even more saddened by their own life. But I would agree with you. One of the things that we need to do more is take an honest look at where we are sometimes in life. And we're looking for the bug, we're looking for the mold, we're looking for the organism that's creating the stress response, instead saying, hey, maybe it's my thinking, maybe it's where I am, I'm just not happy in my direction or my surroundings or my environment. And that's sometimes the hardest thing to be willing to change. And we may gravitate to, instead of really addressing that thing or one of those things that's the biggest thing that's impacting us, we put the blinders onto that and look for this external thing that's making us sick and stressed, and we're not aware of the thing that's inside us, which is our own thought process, our own perseveration of thoughts and ideas, that's actually creating a lot of the things that are jacking our cortisol or causing this thing that may be termed adrenal fatigue. So Joel, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. As always, it's a great conversation. But why don't we finish with you? Just kind of let people know where you're at. I know you've got a relatively newer website, The Truth About Adrenal Fatigue. So let people know where you are, where they can find you, how they could work with you if they had an interest in working with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, you're right. The Truth About Adrenal Fatigue, and then just Dr. Joel Rosen on Instagram and on YouTube, and lots of videos on Facebook. I do have a big Facebook group. It's called Adrenal Fatigue Recovery, or Dr. Joel Rosen's The Truth About Adrenal Fatigue. So just Google my name and you'll be able to find me. And I appreciate, again, the time that we had together as well today, Eric. Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Until next time. I'll see you. Enjoy the rest of the day in Florida, and maybe I'll see you live soon somewhere. All right.
Awesome. Sounds good, Eric. Be good.
Take care.